Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the ISE webinar on apprentice assessment reform and the introduction of apprenticeship units. We've covered apprenticeships in a couple of webinars, and we had our fantastic apprentice conference on March the 4th, which I hope that many of you were able to go to. This is a significant area in the UK economy and certainly in the minds of our members. Apprenticeship reform, ever since the introduction of Skills England back in June of last year, and with the many announcements, some of which we will cover today. But just as a heads up, there is so much going on in this space that undoubtedly we won't be able to cover everything that you've got in mind today. But I'm delighted to welcome to this webinar Carmel Grant, Deputy Director, Reform and Development at Skills England. You may, if you went to the Apprentice Conference, have seen that Carmel presented to us on that event. And Rob May, Managing Director of Innovate, one of the leading assessment organisations, and delighted and thankful to have your input today both. So we've got an hour. We will hear from both of the presenters. Carmel's going to speak first, then hand back to me, and then I will introduce Rob, who'll say a little bit from his perspective, and then Rob and I are going to have a Q&A exchange from the perspective of member queries, really, that are very relevant for an assessment organisation. We want as many questions that you have as possible to be answered, so please use the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. That's where you need to post your questions. I will be keeping an eye on those, and I will pick those up, and then I will chair a Q&A session in the last 15 minutes, if you like, of the session with both Carmel and with Rob. So please put those in the Q&A rather than the chat. And I will, without hesitation, now hand over to Carmel. Say a little bit more about yourself, Carmel, and then take us through some of those reforms.
Thank you so much, Anne-Marie, and thank you for inviting Skills England. I'm just going to share my slides, so would welcome a thumbs up if you can see those.
All good.
All good, thank you. As Anne-Marie said, I'm Carmel Grant from Skills England. I don't know how many people on the call are aware of Skills England. I'm sure a fair few. We were established back in June of last year. I personally head up the apprenticeships and qualifications portfolio, but Skills England as an organisation was set up as the national body for identifying skills needs and responding to those skills needs with new products and services quickly and in a way that those of you who perhaps have been involved in future development of occupational standards, we're bringing in new ways of working to try and respond to skills requirements more quickly and in a more agile way. What I should say, at the heart of Skills England still remains the occupational standards, so that's very much at the heart of our work, and all our products still hang off those occupational standards, including apprenticeships and qualifications, and that ranges from everything from T levels through to high technical qualifications, and also the forthcoming V levels as well. But we are also doing a lot more in the space beyond the occupational standards. I'm just going to hopefully move slide on. Sorry, I'm not very familiar with Zoom, so I'm just trying to... Can I just check, Anne-Marie, you can see that next slide?
Yes, I can.
Great,
Yeah.
thank you. Looks like technology is working, or I'm able to make it work. So in terms of Skills England's role, it centres very much around these three aspects here. So really understanding the nation's skills and getting behind that, getting under the skin of that, so that we can understand more about what is needed now, what needs to be future-proofed, and how we respond to those sort of growth requirements that meet both employer demand, but also provide employees with up-to-date value-added skills and knowledge. So that's particularly around that first understanding section. We also want to play a part, as many partners do, in simplifying access to skills, and that covers some of our perhaps more new services that we're doing, which I'll come on to in a moment, or the introduction of where we're working with employers around the country, particular skills needs to introduce, perhaps regionally before rolling out nationally. And most importantly is mobilising all our partners in the co-creation of solutions. So not just the occupational standards, but how can we come together to bring, or basically to turn those insights that many partners show us and turn that into action and really practical solutions. So hopefully that sort of sets out the sort of quite broad remit that we have in Skills England going forward. And what I wanted to focus on before getting into more of the assessment reforms, which will be the sort of main part today, is just to talk a little bit about some of the recent announcements since, and some of you on the call may have been at the event in early May where I sort of shadowed some of these. So you're probably aware on the 16th of March there was quite a wide-ranging announcement around support to youth, but also from Skills England's perspective, some practical products that we are introducing. That includes the apprenticeship units. So these are units that are based on the occupational standards, so they draw on the knowledge and skills of the occupational standards, but they are shorter, sharper forms of training. And this is very much in response to employers who've said to us, apprenticeships serve a great purpose, but they're not always right for the things that employers particularly need at a point in time. So this is more about reskilling. So you may already be working in the occupation, you may already be working in the sector, but you need a specific element without needing to do a whole apprenticeship. So those 7 new apprenticeship units, as they were introduced, they're going to be available from April. We know providers are starting to gear up to deliver those, and they'll roll out over a period of time. At the moment, they cover areas in the AI, clean energy and construction space. So, for example, the AI leadership, we have welding there, and solar panels. We will work on others, again, taking data and evidence from the partners I mentioned before as to what more is needed, what more would work going forward. Clearly, they'll have to be set against the available budget, but we'll be working with DWP on gathering that evidence, providing the case for any new ones, and they will be rolled out at a future point. But on that, and Anne-Marie actually mentioned it, we having not long launched 7, we did actually launch an 8th one this week. Yes, Monday, which is the battery manufacturing one. Now that is both a combination of the sort of apprenticeship unit, but it's also very much based on that last bullet that hopefully you can see on the screen about our investment service. And this has come about where in the sort of southwest there was a particular need to upskill in battery manufacturing. The apprenticeship standard that was available wasn't the thing that was needed in its entirety. So we have worked with a variety of partners to develop something that can really hone in on those battery manufacturing skills. But also importantly, it can be replicated around the country, so it's not a one-off. So delighted to say that we've been able to launch that or announce that this week, and then the logistical arrangements around that in terms of delivery will follow shortly. So hopefully that brings to life how we are adapting the service and bringing in things as needed, but in a much more at pace way than perhaps previously. And this particular one, the battery manufacturing, links back to our fast track service that we announced during National Apprenticeship Week about doing changes in around 3 months. Now that doesn't apply to new apprenticeship standards because generally they will take longer than 3 months, but it's very much if can we meet a need by taking an existing standard and producing a short, sharp training product within that time frame. So this is the first example of that, as well as being an apprenticeship unit. One of the other things I'll just pick up on there is the foundation apprenticeships. So these were launched last year. A further 2 were announced on the 16th of March, and these are foundation apprenticeships in retail and hospitality. So very much that breadth at level 2 for people going into that sector, and we'll continue to look where else those foundation apprenticeships might work going forward. So hopefully that's given you a sense of Skills England, in terms of its purpose, its remit, and some of the things it's starting to do with the occupational standards at the heart of it, but going wider with a wider remit that really does play to the strengths of the skills system and bringing things in quickly as needed, and also future-proofing them as well. I'll just move on, conscious of time, to the apprenticeship assessment reform. And again, I talked briefly about this earlier in the month. Those not familiar with this, this is a set of reforms that were brought in on the back of evidence from employers and training providers around some of the endpoint assessments for apprenticeships perhaps being too burdensome, too much assessment, logistically quite difficult to deliver. Not in all cases, but this led to a body of work resulting in what you can see on the screen here, or a set of assessment principles that were launched by DFE policy colleagues, now DWP colleagues, back in February 2025. Without going through all of them, picking out some of the obvious ones, they're trying to remove any unnecessary duplication, allowing on-programme assessment, so earlier assessment, as well as assessment at the end of an apprenticeship. This was very much in response to a lot of feedback we had, particularly for the longer apprenticeships, and also enabling shorter plans with minimum level prescription or appropriate level of prescription. So against those principles, Skills England are revising the assessment plans for each of the apprenticeship standards that are in delivery. We started that work in the summer with some pilots, which were really useful. We picked different standards with different characteristics, but that really provided a real strong foundation for implementing the revisions at scale. And we are now moving forward to those. And I'll talk a little bit about progress in a moment of where we've got to since we've sort of moved into implementation sort of around the end of November, beginning of December. But in order just to very briefly highlight what this looks like without going into all of the technical detail, essentially the endpoint assessment plans we have today will move to a two-stage process. The first stage is Skills England will take the standard, it will look at it will produce basically a draft plan drawing out the assessment outcomes that need to be delivered within the new assessment, the performance descriptors, any mandatory knowledge and skills. So essentially a sort of a plan that is developed initially and then tested with an expert panel. And these expert panels include employers previously drawn from our trailblazers or other employers who may wish to join, assessment organisations and training providers. And that's so we get a really strong representation into testing that plan. Is it going to be fit for purpose? Has it identified all the characteristics of that particular standard or that sector that are really critical to achieve competence? So that's the first part. That plan then goes through various iterations, and then once approved by Skills England, we then essentially transfer to the assessment organisations, who will then produce their second stage 2 of the plan. And this is the real detail in terms of the assessment strategy, the assessment specification, pulling together all the elements of the first part of the plan, and of course the assessment materials. And then those two parts will be the whole that is then moved into publication and delivery in due course. I have simplified what is quite a complex set of arrangements into this slide, but hopefully for those who are familiar it makes sense, and for those of you who aren't, hopefully it just really sets out clearly what this plan will look like. So the endpoint assessment plans we have today, moving forward to a two-stage process which brings together a comprehensive plan, but has allowed more innovation, less prescription where necessary. And assessment organisations can bring in new technologies, etc., etc. So that's the approach. I will. Oh no! I'll move on to sort of progress where we are today. As I mentioned earlier, we started implementation at scale in November, learning very much from the pilots that we had run. earlier in the year. We now have, as of today, 44 plans that have been published, so 44 that have gone through that stage one process and are now waiting for the assessment organisations to do their part of it. At this stage, I probably should just mention one of the pilot plans, which we get asked a lot about. So in the 5 pilots, there was one in construction, a carpentry and joinery plan. And it's clear going through that there were actually wider issues that were sparked, and not just around assessment, but around some of the regulatory issues, some of the building regulatory changes that were coming in. And we decided to pause at that point construction and bring together a construction task force of construction representatives. And what we're doing is looking particularly at areas of concerns over safety critical, over areas of competence and other factors, and how we can bring together a plan for each standard that's is within the principal framework you saw earlier, but addresses those concerns of the sector. That's now moving forward. We have 8 standards now going through that process, and if anybody is on the call and involved, many thanks, because it's been a real test case, which will also be valuable to other areas, particularly where there are safety critical aspects that must be built in to the assessment each time. So that's where we are with construction, and we're taking that learning and applying it to other sectors as well. In terms of moving forward with implementation, we're doing this in a staged approach. We've essentially set out 3 phases. We're at the start of phase 2 now. We have, as I say, published 44 plans. We've actually approved over 80. We're just going through final checks on the remaining ones before publication, and we're now moving into the next stage of plans. The sequencing of plans was prioritised for different reasons. They could align to the industrial strategy. There may be plans currently in delivery that aren't quite working, and a variety of reasons. So plans have been sequenced. We publish what the sequencing is. For those of you who are involved with us more in our day-to-day work, we have a revisions and adjustments report that gets published, and that confirms the plans we're looking at now and the plans that have been approved. And it is also a way for employers and assessment organisations who want to get involved in that and haven't already been invited to be part of that, to contact us and say we'd like to be part of the development of this plan. So they can do that through contacting us through that report that's published on a 4 to 6 weeks basis. In the remaining couple of minutes, I'll just briefly touch on a couple of areas that have been issues throughout implementation. So we have mandated quals in many of our apprenticeships, and there are different ways that these will be treated in the new plan. So, for example, mandated quals could actually cover all aspects of the knowledge and skills required from the apprenticeship, and therefore there will be no need for an additional assessment plan. In other cases, some of the mandated quals may cover some of the knowledge and skills, but not all of them, and therefore there will be a separate plan produced. So there will be an assessment plan, but a shorter, sharper version that sits alongside the mandated qual, and that assessment plan, along with all other assessment plans, will be regulated by the appropriate regulators, including Ofqual. There's been quite a lot of points raised around content sampling, and I just wanted to stress today for people who perhaps, again, not too close to this, that content sampling is permitted, but it is looked at on a case-by-case basis. So all knowledge and skills will be taught, but in some cases, not all knowledge and skills will be tested each time. They'll be tested over a series of time. So part of working through that stage 1, stage 2 process is to determine what does need to be tested each time, similar to qualifications, to ensure occupational competency, and assessment organisations will work through that as they develop the full plan. And finally, because some of my other points may come up in questions, so finally, for those of interest, we, alongside, of course, a regulatory framework that will be published soon, Skills England will also be publishing what we call a general requirements document, and that sets out in more technical detail how the plans are put together and how those guardrails are put around them to ensure that we protect occupational competency, and produce plans that really do work for sectors. So that will come out in April. But hopefully I've given you sort of the main points of where the assessment reforms are going. We're continuing to roll those out through to the summer and into early autumn. But happy to take any questions after Rob has completed his session. I will stop sharing. Thank you.
Thanks, Carmel. Sorry, I'm trying to turn my camera back on, which doesn't seem to be doing, but um, I will continue to try to get that off. Um, Right. There we go. Right, done. Thank you very much, Carmel. And as you said, plenty of time to answer questions. So please keep putting those in the Q&A, and I'll field them between Rob and Carmel towards the end of the session. But if I'd like to introduce Rob now to come forward onto the session. Rob from Innovate, Managing Director of Innovators, as I said. How we're going to play this bit is I've got quite a lot of questions. Kate, I know you've already put a question in the Q&A, which I'll put to Rob. But Rob, tell us a little bit about your perspective as an assessment organisation. Then we can have that discussion around some of these questions.
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone. As Anne-Marie says, my name's Rob May. I'm the Managing Director at Innovate Awarding. I joined Innovate in the autumn, which feels like a good time to be joining with all the change which has been going on. Although I've been working in awarding for 20 years. And also as a school and university governor, which has been helpful in seeing how everything clips together and where those friction points are and those synergies are across the whole education system. So I think it might be useful, Anne-Marie, just to take a step back and briefly explain what an awarding organisation does,
Mhm.
rather than
Yep.
assume everyone is aware of that. Essentially, an awarding organisation or endpoint assessment organisation it checks and confirms that an apprentice has reached the level of occupational competency required to do the job. So the employer provides the job and the work experience. The training provider teaches the knowledge and skills, and the awarding organisation comes in to independently assess and quality assure the process around that assessment to ensure that the learner has reached the required level. And it's that assessment and that quality assurance which gives confidence to the public and confidence to employers that everyone who comes out of that process with an apprenticeship or qualification has reached a level which is reliable and consistent across the whole country. So that's what we do. Within that system, Innovate Awarding, as you kindly mentioned, is one of the leading assessment organisations in that space. Our role is to design assessments, to assure the quality, and create those assessment materials, which Carmel referenced just a moment ago. And in terms of our perspective on the reforms, from Innovate's perspective, I think the reforms actually create a great deal of opportunity for us, and the big change that everyone needs to kind of hold on to, I suppose, is this change from an endpoint assessment to an on-program assessment. That is really the key pivot with the system as far as assessment activity is concerned. In the current system, we have one big high stakes assessment event at the end of the program. In the new model assessment, assessments are going to be integrated across the learner journey. So there could be two or more assessments taking place during that 8-month duration period of the apprenticeship delivery. So what employers should notice is less cliff edge final assessment events, and a reduction, therefore, of all the tension and anxiety and complexity, which goes along with having to coordinate and motivate learners towards that big final assessment piece. So that should make a much smoother learner journey for employees who are going for their apprenticeship program. What we should see as well is assessment which is more integrated with the actual job. So again, rather than the assessment organisation swooping in at the end of the programme and carrying out this assessment, we will now have to align and integrate better with employers' rhythms and workflows in terms of when the assessment itself is conducted. So again, potentially a quicker and smoother completion process for learners. And the other opportunity I see is that I've always felt that assessment organizations are quite transactional. They have quite transactional relationships with providers and employers. Quite technocratic at times, and we need to be. We're regulated by Ofqual, and we're upholding standards, which which are very important. But even so, having spent 20 years in the sector, I've always felt that we're perhaps a bit too bureaucratic at times. And I think what this new system enables us to do is to move from being an assessment organisation to being an assessment partner. And as I said, because we have these new touch points with the learner journey, and now that we have to consult more with employers than perhaps we did before as a sector. I'm talking about now. That creates a real opportunity for us to ensure that the assessment is fit for purpose, that it meets employer needs, that we can support the readiness of the learner, that we can take into account things like neurodivergent learners, that we can take into account things like seasonality in various industries, and we can create assessment strategies which incorporate all of that. So I think the opportunity for awarding organisations is that we can lean in now a lot more into the employer's world, which I think is a good thing and will improve outcomes for learners, I'm sure.
Thanks, Rob. That's really helpful. And it's, as we've discussed before, we've had so many questions from members, and I'm sure they're very similar to the questions that you hear. But I guess one of the things that I pick up on, you were talking about that, what is an awarding organisation? You talk about independently assess and quality assure. And I guess that's one of the underlying questions that we've heard is this. We mustn't forget either that these reforms were driven through employers. It was the need for the process to be less complex and less duplicative, more agile, all of those positive things. But I guess there is a concern perhaps from employers that more flexibility could introduce more inconsistency and concern about that. So I guess it's, how do you think awarding organisations continue to shape the assessment process to ensure that validity of outcomes, that quality assurance that you referred to?
So I think the key thing to remember is that in the rules and in the conditions, the legal basis underpinning everything is that assessment organisations will continue to retain overall responsibility for the quality and reliability of the apprenticeship assessment. So a key feature of the reforms is that some of the assessment, depending on the assessment plan published, some of the assessment may be conducted by the training provider. Okay, so this is what we're calling at Innovate a dual assessment model or a dual assessment approach, and there are two ways that assessment can occur. For the mandatory assessment, it will always be conducted by the assessment organisation, but for other assessments, they could be conducted by the training provider, and we're calling that blended assessment. Okay, so that's one approach, blended assessment. We can still continue to offer what we're calling total assessment, which is, as it is now, all of the assessment activity is outsourced to the expert awarding organisation to conduct that assessment. And some training providers and colleges and employers have already said they don't want to go down the blended assessment route because they don't have the infrastructure, they don't have the assessor workforce, they don't have the time or bandwidth to create that function within their organisations. They'd rather leave that where it naturally exists at the moment with the assessment organisation. Other training providers, which are perhaps a bit more geared up in terms of their assessment capabilities, are quite interested in the blended assessment approach, and our dual assessment method allows for both of those. But for training providers which do go down the blended assessment route, that there are certain conditions which they have to meet. Okay, they do need to demonstrate to us that they have an appropriately trained assessor workforce, but we can wrap around training and support around that to ensure that they do have those assessors in place. Importantly, they will have to assure us that they can recognize and manage conflicts of interest. Okay, so you don't have someone who's invested in a learner outcome also marking the learner's work. That's perhaps quite a difficult piece. And I think that's where we're getting a lot of questions at the moment from training providers. What does independence actually mean? What does it look like? For us, it could be somebody who is an assessor, but perhaps assessing a different cohort of learners, just somebody who's not been involved in directly in the training process. The training provider will also need to ensure they have adequate internal quality assurance arrangements in place to make sure they're managing those conflicts of interest, and that they will have to connect to our external quality assurance and moderation processes as well, because we will have to moderate everything, all of these assessments, to ensure that they reach a national benchmark of standardization. So it's not as simple as training providers simply taking on the marking process and then just giving out the results. There's a lot of interaction and integration that they still have to do with the assessment organization.
Yeah, thank you. And another thing occurs to me when you said that is like looking at the perspective of employers. And as you know, and I'll remind attendees on the call, my background is as an employer, so I'm sort of always putting my employer hat on. So, do you think then that the way you talked about, the opportunity for blended assessment or the fact that it could be totally outsourced, is that a factor that employers need to think about when they are essentially securing their contract, their statement of work, if you will, with their training provider?
So I think employers should definitely ask what the training provider's approach is going to be, and they should assure themselves that they're confident with that training provider's approach if they are going down the blended assessment route. And employers themselves can also have a say in that. They can say, well, we want all of our assessment to be outsourced, or they're comfortable with the blended assessment approach. So they can have a voice in that process.
And can you tell me a little bit more about then because it feels like there's this various people involved in the quality assurance. So the assessment organization, the training provider, you talked about, everybody would need to have the confidence that the metrics were in place, the independence, the dealing with the conflict of interest. Who ultimately is the arbiter to say, yes, all of these things are in place, and we are confident that this matrix of organizations or at least combination of organizations that are involved will indeed be able to truly verify the competence of these young people coming out of their apprenticeship?
Ultimately, will be the assessment organisation still, as I said, because we do have
Right.
that legal
Okay.
basis in the conditions that we're overall responsible for that. And as I said, I think if a training provider is approaching us, as some have, and said we're interested in blended assessment because we do already have an assessment workforce and the appropriate controls, and protocols in place, then we're not taking that at face value. They would need to enter into an agreement with us. They would need to enter into a continuous process of quality assurance, and that is something which we will have to maintain, because it's something which Ofqual will ensure that we've got those valid checks in place, checks and balances in place ourselves.
Cool, I understand that. Another question we discussed ahead of the session, and you alluded to it again at the beginning about the whole idea of what we've been used to is the EPA, the endpoint assessment. I remember as an employer, you're always driven, well, have they got through their EPA yet? Because that was what line managers, because that's the only thing we need, because then we can bring them into the substantive workforce. And I guess that it's I don't, and I think you mentioned to me when we were preparing for this webinar, these reforms don't mean the end of the EPA. It's not that this doesn't exist anymore. There is. So can you just say a little bit more about what is that final conclusion, tick in the box, if you will, for these young apprentices?
So EPA is going as a term, I suppose, as a concept, but I suppose it might be replaced with a final assessment. Okay, so if we assume in the assessment plan that there's two assessments taking place, one might be, I don't know, an observation, which takes place in the workplace, and maybe a training provider or the assessment organisation conducts that. And then what happens is that learner's results will be stored and recorded on our. We use a software as a service platform called Proficient. It used to be called EPA Pro. Some listeners might be familiar with it. That's all recorded there, and then when the candidate is ready to go to the final assessment, we would come in, depending on which way around we're doing it, and do that assessment. Let's say it's a professional discussion. Could be a number of assessments, and then we record that on EPA Pro. And then what happens is that the candidate it goes through what's being termed a gateway to completion. Okay, and this is a different, confusingly similar, but a different concept to the current gateway.
Yeah, because there's different terminology, isn't there? It used to be gateway, it's now gateway to completion is the new terminology.
So currently the gateway means you're ready to be assessed. You're ready to go into your endpoint assessment event. That's the gateway you go through. The gateway to completion means that you're now ready to go through to final certification, and that just means that the employers verified that the behaviours have been met, which are in the assessment standard, and all the final checks take place to ensure that that everything's been passed and the candidate can complete.
Thank you. And just while you've just talked about some of the roles of the employer and touched upon behaviours, and we're so used to in apprentice world, aren't we, talking about the KSBs? They need to meet the KSBs of the standard and those being set out. But the B bit, the behaviours bit, is the bit that feels like it's moving out of, well, it is, I think, literally moving out of endpoint assessment and going into the employer world. A couple of thoughts on that. I mean, I won't ask a multiple question. So starting with the first question, what would you say are the considerations from an employer's perspective that they are now taking on the element of assessing and verifying behaviours?
So you're absolutely right. Knowledge and skills and behaviours are sort of being split up. But a key thing, I suppose, for employers to keep in mind is that they're not assessing behaviours. There's no assessment requirement. They're validating that certain behaviours have naturally occurred in the workplace. So in terms of how that's captured, it is something where I think we do need a bit more clarity on, and we need to look at some various models as to how that can be achieved. One thing I'm seeing is that training providers currently have 12-week tripartite meetings with employers and candidates, and it could be used there. It could be used there to keep that continuous visibility that the behavioural elements of an apprenticeship standard are being met. And I would suggest that that's perhaps a more manageable way of doing it, rather than having some sort of clipboard event at the end to try and artificially capture behaviours. I think and this might be easier for larger employers than smaller employers. And I think this is the key issue. So, a larger employer which has a very well-defined performance, development review framework will probably find that it's capturing evidence of behaviours pretty frequently within its business. A smaller employer, less so, and you could get down to, like, say, a very small employer, a micro employer, a garage or something like that, where a father and son team, and the father is verifying rather, sorry, the behaviours of the son. So you can get down to some quite tricky examples if you go down that route, and I don't think we've received that much clarity at the moment on how that validation of behaviours is going to be captured, and what the handrails are around that part of the process.
Yeah. And I'm just an advance warning for Carmel. I'll feed that into the Q&A in a moment when we come to the wider point. Kirsty, I've picked up your point on the Q&A, and that's the one that is coming a lot. I think it's around because I come from a large employer background, so yeah, I can see exactly how in the tripartite meetings, in the performance review process, that our lot in my old business, our line managers were already charged with this validation, verification. But that is a lot of work, and I think, as Kirsty's point, it's a big undertaking for some employers. So, Carmel, I'll get your thoughts in a moment. But just one more question, if I may, in the pre the general Q&A that I had, Rob, which was around the transition. I think that's another thing that the members have asked. We've got. You could have an apprentice who came on a 4-year program. They started their program in September 24, pre the emergence of Skills England as the replacement for IFATE. So pre all of these changes, they're mid-program, and they are in mid-flight, as I would call them. And then you've got some who will be coming in this September, and they'll be different. They might be doing the same apprenticeship standard and following the same program, but they'll be in different flight paths. So as an assessment organisation, how are you managing those sort of parallel train tracks, if you will, with different types of learners on different basically following a different structure?
It's a great way to describe it. It simply is parallel train tracks. We are going to have a transitionary period where we have learners who are on an existing standard and learners which are on a new standard. In most cases, if the learner has been working through the standard for a significant amount of time, then we will certainly be encouraging them to stay on that standard and see it through. There's no financial benefit to the training provider to transition, because the funding is set at the point of registration. So they won't suddenly benefit from any new funding allocation if they switch. It will depend on the standard, and there could be some cases where it makes sense to transition a learner across, but in many cases it's simply not interchanging one test for another. Okay, we will have to do a standard to standard mapping exercise to ensure that what's been the competencies and the knowledge and skills which have been included in the previous test map into the new test, and there's completion and coherence around that process. So for a while we go through this transitionary phase into Apprenticeship 2.0, we are going to be working on twin tracks. The additional complication, and I saw one of the listeners put in something saying, "Won't this be hugely expensive for awarding bodies?" The answer is yes, it will.
That was what I was going to ask you. That was Kate Ross who put that in. And so
because we'll be running that twin track, but then in one of those tracks, it's going to be a blended or total. Don't forget, it's sort of 3 tracks, if you like, which we're going to be having to manage. So I think when we can, we will transition candidates across, but only if it makes sense to do so, because we will be at all times guided by the off qual no detriment principle. which means that we cannot disadvantage a learner. A transition must not disadvantage a learner. And as we're running these processes side by side, we'll always be thinking about what's best for the learner, and is the final assessment and completion still going to be reliable if we change their process.
Thank you. So thank you ever so much. We'll continue this questions and hopefully give even more information out to members throughout the rest of this conversation. But I'm going to bring Carmel. Thank you for coming back on camera, Carmel, because bring Carmel back into the conversation. So, yeah, I mean, Kirsty. On the Q&A, and please put more questions up. I'll keep an eye on them. Kirsty mentioned this point, and I guess, Carmel, the way that I'm thinking about it, I mean, the way that you described it was very insightful at the beginning, and you reflected on the fact this is driven by employers, the desire, as I said, to have less complex EPA structures to avoid duplication, provide more flexibility, aligned to business need. You've echoed that, Rob, aligned to business priorities and business deliverables. But I guess one of the concerns, Carmel, from members, particularly employer members, is this is quite a lot for some organisations to take on board that they don't already do as part of their normal processes. So, what advice would you share on how employers can best take on that responsibility of the B bit of the KSBs from the apprentice assessment?
Yeah, sure. And I think both you and Rob have picked up on aspects already. So, I mean, Rob mentioned in the current system that those employer engagement on behaviours happens already in the system, and I think you, Anne-Marie, mentioned about obviously it depends on the organisation, but we see employer behaviours as very much part of normal sort of performance management processes, and I realise that sometimes depending on the size of the organisation they will be structured slightly differently. But I think in this change, a lot of that employer involvement in behaviours is already ongoing, but perhaps in a more subtle way, given the way the EPA works at the moment. What we will be doing, Skills England, that is, in recognising this, we will be putting out, and I didn't mention it in my presentation, but alongside the general requirements document, which is the technicalities of putting a plan together, we will also put out some short guidance in April, which will just address some of the points we've heard around employee behaviours, to try and give a bit more information and guidance, not to provide a prescriptive process at all, but just to bring together how it could operate going forward. So hopefully that will be helpful to members. But I say we are very keen that this general requirements document, which some people will be really interested in, is quite a detailed document. Employee behaviours we want to make really sharp and short and pertinent to the key questions that people are asking us. So we'll issue that, I say, later on in April.
Thanks, Carmel. And I'll pick up on some of the questions that I heard from members ahead of the session as well. It follows on really, Carmel. So I'd like to keep you on camera for this bit, to answer this question, but around the confidence, I guess, that people have in whether this increased flexibility, the move away from this kind of cliff edge endpoint assessment, but with all the things that Rob described, the concern that has been raised that apprenticeships might be perceived as less rigorous and less comparable. I mean, what's the Skills England perspective on that?
Yeah, I mean, we are very clear that the apprenticeship quality that has been built up over the years is absolutely the heart of the reforms going forward. So it is in nobody's interest to reduce competency, and that's why that process I described earlier of 2 stages of working through on a plan that hopefully is innovative, is less prescriptive, but it has employers at the heart of that plan, pointing out to us where they are concerned. So that construction example I gave you, where there is a real practical example of critical safety areas that must be built into the assessment each time. That is an example of that in practice. But we are working through on a sector by sector basis, standard by standard basis, and that appears in other sectors. There are other issues in other sectors that need to be part of that. So in producing this plan and in the assessment organisations, awarding organisations like Rob's doing their part of the plan, that coming together, we absolutely want to protect the occupational competency, protect the quality of the apprenticeship programme. And I probably would also allude to the fact that I've worked on qualifications quite a lot in recent years, and that those qualifications have been built on the occupational standards, and we've had the same approach. That now they're not always full occupational competency depending on the qualification, but at the heart of it is making sure that the assessments that the awarding organisations design absolutely do have those guardrails around them and bring the quality and the expertise with the learner coming out at the other end. So I think in summary, it is in all our interest to maintain that quality, and that's how we are working through it on a standard by standard basis. But we need employers to help us with that. The awarding organisations, assessment organisations will need employers as well in that part too, to say yes, this, with this approach, this will work for us. I mean, there are bound to be issues as we roll out, but we want to address those head on. And I would also say the regulatory frameworks as well that sit around those. So I mentioned the Ofqual one coming out, that puts the guardrails around that, as Rob also mentioned earlier. So I think there's lots of, in terms of the design of it, there's lots of guardrails around it, but in terms of the delivery as well, those guardrails are in place. And what we should see is fully competent individuals coming out of their apprenticeship, but hopefully having a better experience of assessment where it hasn't quite worked for people in the past, or where there are opportunities to do it earlier, particularly in longer apprenticeships. So hopefully those benefits will come through, as well as the quality of the existing system.
Thanks, Carmel. Definitely, I mean, I would say in my experience as an employee, you heard all the time about we don't want to leave everything till the end. The learner experience wasn't always great in that process. And Rob, you alluded to that as well, with better learner experience, with this greater agility to meet the actual work they're doing, that their role. Just wanted Rob to come to you. Do you have anything to add on that point about the perception or the potential of perception that this makes it less rigorous, less of the quality issue? Because you brought out quality very much in the start of your comments.
Yeah, I think that is a key challenge for the apprenticeship brand, if you like, because we are entering a system where essentially we have four different products occupying the apprenticeship brand space. We've got the apprenticeship, we've got the foundation apprenticeship, we have apprenticeship units as well being introduced, and we have what I would describe as proxy apprenticeships, which is when you have a mandatory qualification occupying the whole apprenticeship space, as it were. So which is not necessarily a bad thing. I think if we want flexibility, and we're recognizing that learners have different jump on points and employers have different needs around upskilling and so on and so forth, then that flexibility is not necessarily a bad thing. But we just need to make sure that from a quality point of view, it all hangs together. There's a currency to all of these things. So apprenticeship units is one area in particular where I would be keen to ensure that they are portable units of learning, that they have a currency outside of their immediate use case, that they can ladder into to other learner journeys, and they are part of a lifelong learning experience. Because even though a lot of the focus, as we all know now, for entirely legitimate reasons, is on early career and young workforce and the NEETs crisis, we do still need to recognise that apprenticeships are part for everyone of a lifelong learning journey, and they should communicate with that broader journey. So I think there's a real challenge here for everyone, all stakeholders, employers, Skills England, awarding organisations, to ensure that we don't cut corners with things like also I'm sure we won't, but with things like quality and consistency. But I think the guidelines which are coming out from Skills England and Ofqual are very clear at baking in those real key points in terms of how we ensure that quality.
Thanks, Rob. And I'm actually, we've only got 5 minutes left, but I want to pick up on some of the questions Gillian particularly has posed in the Q&A box. So Carmel, I'm sort of coming back to you. If I can sort of wrap these together, I think a lot of it is around apprenticeship units, where is there a plan to reintroduce management standards in line with career progression? The upskilling in management, I think, is part of the concept here. And then sort of echoed to some extent by Kirsty saying, well, is there any scope for upskilling managers to be better at being assessors if they are using using their performance management processes to validate those behaviours? And really then just a question, what is the future focus for apprenticeship units? So that's a lot rolled into one, but it's around about, so the future for apprenticeship units, how much is there going to be a future to use apprenticeship, or will there be apprenticeship units on management and management skills? I guess if you could maybe address those questions, Carmel.
Yeah, sure. So on the sort of general apprenticeship units, as people will have gathered, this is the first set that we've introduced. So we were asked to look in very specific areas around AI, clean energy, and as you can imagine, the AI space that is moving so quickly. So that was the premise, to bring some in as what we call wave one. We are looking at which ones would be appropriate for wave two, and that will be the data and evidence that we gather from various sources. I talked earlier about the different partners we're working with around the country, the data sources we have on the labour market and the job vacancy market. So in a way that we wouldn't necessarily have done in the past working on occupational standards, we are drawing in much more data and evidence. And I think, is there a case to create more short courses, apprenticeship units with the current occupational standards? So essentially, it's where that data and evidence will lead us. I would caveat that whatever comes next will obviously be subject to affordability considerations by DWP. So we don't have, there are definitely 4 or 5 coming now, but we are working, as I say, through that to see what comes next. Specifically on the management and leadership, I think one of the questions was around, would these be reintroduced? So they are being defunded, as people will know. The standards remain on our occupational maps for either private funding or indeed for qualification purposes. And I know we're here to talk about apprenticeships today, but I often say this, our occupational standards underpin qualifications from level 2 to level 6. So that's why they remain on the maps. But for apprenticeship purposes, they are being defunded. Obviously, we don't need to go. I know you've got other sessions where you might want to go into the detail, that obviously this is all part of the bigger picture and pivoting more to youth, etc. But in the same way I mentioned on the general approach to apprenticeship units, where the data and evidence leads us, is there a requirement that would actually lead us to create a unit that would really work in this space? We don't have that information yet. We are obviously having people contacting us on the back of the announcement to say that we think this would work in this area. So we will work with partners, or work with DWP, and take forward that information to see if there is a case in this particular sector, but also in other sectors as well.
Thanks, Kamal. And yes, just an advisory to members and attendees on the call. This is a big topic. The management upskilling, management skilling, defunding. There's much more than we can cover in the next minute and a half that we have left here. So absolutely, we will be putting on further events to have debates on those topics. One quick thing I wanted to ask: apprenticeship units, Carmel, assessment of those, is that going into an awarding organisation like Rob's, or different?
No, actually, I'm glad you asked that question, because given we talked a lot about assessment today, so the assessment approach for apprenticeship units, given they are short and sharp, and I don't think I mentioned the hours, but they are between 30 and 140 hours, for example. So the approach to that is that assessment will be light touch. So providers will provide an assessment, a light touch assessment at the end of that unit. In some cases, and this may apply, for example, in engineering ones, there may be a requirement for some form of qualification. So employers may want a qualification, or there may be a regulatory reason. So any existing qualifications could sit alongside the units. But the approach to assessment, all the things that Rob and I have talked about today in terms of apprenticeship assessment reform, do not apply to those assessment units. It's a much lighter touch to reflect the lighter touch approach, and that they are subsets of apprenticeships. So.
Thank you so much. And we are really out of time. So I wanted to thank Carmel. Thank you so much again for your time and your insight from the Skills England perspective. Rob, fascinating to hear your thoughts. And I think those sort of challenging comments you've made around the what employers need to consider, what training providers need to consider, and then what organisations like yourself need to consider. And I think that will hopefully have lent into all of the different lenses that will be from the attendees on the call today. Thank you so much for your attendance, everybody. Hope you found it really useful. Thank you for all the comments. And we will produce the recording. We will produce a blog on this, and therefore we will share that with people who attended this call. But thank you so much, everybody, and have a lovely afternoon. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.